The number of people in intensive care due to COVID-19 climbed again this week in Ontario, hitting a level not seen since mid-October. Ontario's Chief Medical Officer of Health said Monday that getting more treatment options is on the province's to-do list. And with us on what those options could entail, we welcome in Hamilton, Ontario, Dr. Zain Chagla. He's infectious disease physician at St. Joseph's Healthcare Hamilton and associate professor of medicine at McMaster University, and we're happy to welcome him back to our airwaves. How are you doing, Dr. Chagla?
Well, how are you?
Just fine, thanks. All the better for having you on, because you're going to answer all our questions about how COVID-19 antivirals work. And before you and I do a Q&A on that, I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring up this chart, because we want to go through a couple of the options that are on offer right now. One of them is called molnupiravir, and the other Paxlovid. And we want to go just through a bit of a comparing and contrasting on these two different drugs just to see where we're at. So let's get the developers up there. For the first one, Merck & Company and Ridgeback Biotherapeutics. For Paxlovid, it's Pfizer. Everyone's heard of Pfizer. In terms of efficacy, for molnupiravir, 30% reduction in hospitalization and deaths, previously believed to slash the risk by 48%. For Paxlovid, 89% reduction in hospitalization and death. And how about for authorization? The United Kingdom has offered conditional authorization. It has earned FDA recommendation for emergency use authorization, and it's under review by Health Canada. That's the first one, molnupiravir. And for Paxlovid, there are no approvals yet, and it is under review by Health Canada. All right, that's those two. We want to get Dr. Chagla in here right now, and we're going to do some comparing and contrasting. For example, when you look at these two, what are the similarities between them?
I mean, number one, they're pills, right? And so we have no oral treatments for COVID-19, and you know the therapies we're currently using are mainly intravenous and have logistical issues based on that. So having oral options for COVID-19 is going to be incredibly important because it gives us a lot more treatment options. Number two, these two therapies, their success really depends on when you initiate them, right? And we know with antiviral compounds for other illnesses, like the antivirals we use for things like chickenpox or shingles, earlier treatment leads to better outcomes. This is when the virus is replicating aggressively, and when antivirals that shut down viral replication are going to have the most effect. When you let the disease progress to when people end up in hospital and ICU, you start seeing the complications of inflammation and not necessarily the viral complications at that point. And so these therapies, unfortunately, don't work at that point. The molnupiravir compound was trialed in hospital and actually didn't do a lot. Really, the biggest effects were early. So again, oral therapies, early therapies, but certainly that reduction in hospitalization and death that's seen between two of them, which is, again, something that's an advance that we've never had in an oral therapy.
I don't know if you've got hard data on this, but I bet you've got anecdotal evidence on it. Do you know if there's a significant chunk of the population that won't get vaccinated because they're afraid of needles, and therefore being able to take a pill might get them on board?
Yeah, I mean, there's different pieces of people not wanting to be vaccinated. Some of it is needle hesitancy, but it's more related to the mechanisms or the actual thought of the vaccine and what it does rather than the needle. So that we certainly do have patients, for example, that have not wanted to be vaccinated, that have accepted intravenous therapy, which is more invasive than a single needle. So needle phobia, certainly may be a niche for this, but it may be just more related to people that choose not to be vaccinated in general for whatever reason.
Okay, let's get back on the path here. You talked about the similarities between the two options. How about the differences between the two?
Yeah, so mechanistically, they're different. They act on different targets. So molnupiravir works on what's called the RNA polymerase, which is how the virus essentially replicates. And so it actually tries to mimic the nucleic acids of the virus. And so, as the drug is taken up by the virus, it tries to incorporate it into new virus genomes. The drug basically makes that defective, and essentially the virus can't replicate anymore. So really good effects in that sense. And again, very similar to some of the drugs we use for things like shingles, which have similar mechanisms of activity. Paxlovid is a compound that's called a protease inhibitor. And so once the virus replicates, it makes a lot of different proteins that are used to, put together new baby viruses. When protein synthesis happens, they're done as big, big sheets that are eventually chopped apart into little viral segments. And so this molecule essentially blocks that ability for the virus to be cut apart. And so that you get non-functional viruses out there. And again, a similar class of medications that's been used for HIV for some time. And in fact, this Paxlovid compound is actually two drugs. It's the Paxlovid drug, but actually another HIV drug that's been used that has a similar mechanism that boosts the level of this drug in the system in order for people to get as high a dose as possible without having to deal with some of the toxicities.
This is definitely not the most important question I'm going to ask you tonight, but I do want to know, why do the pharmaceutical companies give these drugs such weird, odd, unpronounceable names?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the scientific names usually come from, molecular structures or that type of thing. But these, names, they have focus groups and meetings in terms of how to actually brand these drugs. And you can imagine if it's a tongue twister for everyone, how they're going to market them. But for some reason, the name of antimicrobials has just gotten more and more complicated by the day. It's almost a thesis in terms of how to deal with them. But, that's the way it is. And I guess they'll roll off her tongue eventually.
Okay. Back on the path here. When something like this happens, of course, people get very hopeful. So I suppose it's important for us to remind everybody that there will be limitations on these drugs as well. What are those limitations?
Yeah, I mean, number one, there's going to be a global supply of these drugs. And so, knowing, we are a small market in Canada, there may not be as much access as we would like unrestricted. Number two, you have to find prescribers that are willing to prescribe these drugs. And so, people with clinical experience, people need access to primary care providers that can administer them, or other healthcare workers in the community that are able to administer. Number three, they're not 100%, right? And we talk about, for example, molnupiravir, where the people who got placebo had about 9% hospitalization rate versus 6% who got the drug. Well, that means 6% of those people who got the full course of the drug still ended up being hospitalized. And so, they're not a full solution. And unfortunately, especially in people with multiple comorbidities or of a particular age, this may reduce the risk, which is great, but it by no means takes the risk to zero. And often, again, more preventative therapies like vaccines offer way more benefit in this context.
Is it accurate to say that there is actually not that much peer-reviewed data as it relates to these two drugs?
Yeah, so all the information for these have been either released to healthcare agencies like the FDA and the UK Drugs Administration or Health Canada, but there's not been peer-reviewed studies reviewed in a scientific journal. There's not even been a preprint of these studies. All the scientific community outside of the regulators have seen press releases at this point. And for molnupiravir, we saw a press release 5-6 weeks ago around Thanksgiving, showing that a 50% reduction in hospitalization. We just saw a press release about a week ago showing that actually dropped down to about 30% reduction in hospitalization. And so, again, this is where it gets a little bit dicey in terms of these drugs getting out there. You want peer-reviewed information. You want us to be able to review these drugs appropriately as providers and scientists and guideline advocates in the community. But a lot of COVID has been medicine by press release, unfortunately, and we're seeing it even more right now.
In which case, if you don't have all of that peer-reviewed data that you would like to normally have, what questions do you still have about these two medications?
Yeah, so number one, exactly what groups saw the most benefit, right? So as we're, again, probably seeing this as a limited resource, are we going to prescribe it to everyone? Are we going to, focus it on certain groups? Are certain groups overrepresented in terms of what benefits they got and other groups underrepresented? You want to see safety profiles. Now, they've said that the safety profiles are reasonable, but again, you want to see if there's been serious adverse reactions, if there's serious drug-drug interactions that we need to monitor for. Because again, clinical trial participants are, well-chosen, cherry-picked, well-developed patients. When you start going into real life, you really do have to start looking at, patients that have multiple complex issues, multiple interactions, multiple drug intolerances, and again, what that means. And then finally, you want to see data around the robustness of this across all data sets. And I think this is where the molnupiravir compound came up a little bit, even though it was approved. You saw one analysis of the data showing 50% benefit. You saw another analysis of the data showing 30% benefit. So you really need to break that down and say, what was the difference here between those groups? Was there an overrepresentation? This is a multi-center, multi-country study. So was it just certain data from one country that showed a benefit versus another country, which again may be related more to healthcare in those countries as compared to the drug itself? And so again, if you're going to make a guideline recommendation for these drugs, you really have to be certain in terms of their effects being stable, persistent, and that your patients would actually benefit from them as much or in the same ballpark as the clinical trials.
Are you yet satisfied in your own mind that you know how effective these drugs could be against, let's say, the Delta or the new Omicron variant?
I mean, the one positive mechanism of these drugs is they work internally on the virus. So they work on viral mechanisms of replication, of protein synthesis. As we talk about different variants, the major issue that seems to be changing is the spike protein. So these drugs don't target the spike protein, meaning that their ability to be conserved throughout things like Delta and Omicron would be at least reasonable. In fact, molnupiravir has data, and I think Paxlovid has data for Delta, at least as part of their clinical trial. So, there is where the hope lies, is that we will always have consistent therapies that don't rely on us having to necessarily go to the spike protein like our monoclonal antibodies. So, that is the one benefit of this development, and the one benefit of the pharmaceutical industry really looking at antiviral compounds as a long-term solution.
Let me throw another one of those fancy titles out here now. Monoclonal antibodies. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's start there. What are they?
So monoclonal is really just means one type. And so these are one type of antibody. There are two on the Canadian market. One that is made by Roche, a compound called casirivimab imdevimab, and the other by GSK, which is a compound called sotrovimab. And so, when you think about antibodies, these are the proteins that bind to the virus that we make after we get vaccinated, if we get infected, and they're what leads to our immune response. They bind to the virus, they stick to the virus, and that leads to clearance from the immune system. It leads to the virus not getting into our cells and leading to more replication.
How widely are they being?
Monoclonal antibodies.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, do you know how widely they're used in Canada at the moment?
Yeah, so monoclonal antibodies essentially are these. We give them as humanized antibodies or synthetic antibodies that mimic human antibodies in that sense. They're approved in Canada, and in fact, the two compounds that I mentioned have been approved for the last few months. The implementation issues of these drugs have made it a lot harder to actually get to the market and get to patients. And this is because it's an IV infusion. It has to be given again within a certain time interval of testing positive and having symptoms. An IV infusion for a COVID patient means that you have to go see a COVID patient. It can't be done remotely. You have to actually put in the IV and observe them. People are obviously worried about side effects with infusions and drugs that are going intravenously. So, they have been available. They've been used around the world. They're actually quite, recommended. They're the only drug that's actually recommended by the World Health Organization for the early treatment of COVID-19. But the implementation in Canada has been a bit piecemeal. The Public Health Agency of Canada has bought these drugs. They are sitting in all the provinces for distribution. But again, local solutions have made it a little bit difficult to kind of make this a reality for all patients who need to access them.
Is their use more widespread in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we saw this throughout the last wave in the United States. Some states like Florida actually doubled down on this as part of their reopening strategy to have easy access. So, thousands and thousands of clinics in the States, they're paid for and I think federally subsidized. And so, they're recommended for all sorts of patients aggressively in the United States for the treatment of early COVID-19.
We know that there are more and more people who are getting COVID-19 and for whom the symptoms are not going away, the so-called long COVID. It sticks around and the effects are quite persistent and quite debilitating for some people. Do you know whether these medications would work on long COVID?
Yeah, and this is where the origins of long COVID come from, right? So, there is some discussions around whether or not this is a chronic inflammatory disease and is autoimmune mediated, where, these compounds may not benefit as much. But certainly there is, maybe a still an infectious component. And one of the interesting things that's come up is people who are vaccinated who have long COVID symptoms, a small minority of them, probably 10-15%, actually get profound changes in their symptoms after vaccine. And it really does bring into the question of whether or not all of the infection is gone, and mechanisms like this may actually trigger the immune system to clear the rest of it. So there is a lot of look at monoclonal antibodies as a adjunct to long COVID in terms of describing. It's not there yet, and I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But certainly, we know COVID-19 and long COVID often is associated with severe outcomes from COVID-19, and so these drugs have the ability to at least lower the severity of disease. So they may be able to prevent long COVID complications for, again, people who are able to access them in the manner that they're prescribed for.
Is there an argument to be had here which suggests that if you took these medications prophylactically, as in preventatively, that they might be useful under those conditions?
Yeah, absolutely. So the monoclonal antibodies do have evidence in this setting. There are a number of drugs, including the one that I talked about, casirivimab and imdevimab. There's a compound by AstraZeneca that have been given prior to people being exposed to COVID-19 in high-risk settings like nursing homes or healthcare facilities, showing significant benefits, 80 to 90% reductions in COVID-19 over the course of months and months and months. They're not a perfect solution, but could be, administered to things like high-risk settings, chemotherapy patients, transplant patients, where the benefits of a vaccine are not going to be as profound. And certainly, again, for these oral compounds, Tamiflu, for example, which is the drug we use for influenza, we know if we give it prophylactically or even at the time of an outbreak, it can shut down outbreaks very quickly in a nursing home. And so, again, there's a lot of look at whether or not these oral compounds could be rapidly administered if there is activity in a congregate setting, and using them, again, in terms of prevention rather than necessarily in terms of early treatment. But, again, those studies are weeks and weeks and weeks away.
Okay, you ready for another odd question? I want to ask you about that drug that Donald Trump made so famous, hydroxychloroquine. Has anything transpired between when he took it, and a lot of people thought he was crazy for taking it because it didn't do anything, and now to make people take a second look at it because maybe it's more efficacious now?
So, there was a lot of hope in hydroxychloroquine at the beginning because it was an oral drug. It was available around the world. It was cheap and it was easy to access. And so a lot of clinical trial groups, in fact, in the first 6 months of the pandemic, it was the most studied drug for COVID-19 because everyone could access it, design their little clinical trials, and put everything together. But the unfortunate news is across all domains. So pre-exposure, post-exposure, early treatment, hospitalized treatment, there has not been seen a benefit in terms of reducing symptoms, in terms of reducing the severity of disease, or reducing death. And so, large trials, probably the best trials that were designed in the first 6 months of COVID-19, have not shown any benefit of this drug. And so, I think this is the drug that has largely been disproven through large works. It's unfortunate, but, again, nothing has transpired since then to make it come on the table, given how much study was put into it in the first place.
No benefit, but no harm either?
No, so there are some meta-analysis looking at people who have taken it. It was relatively safe. We were a part of one of those trials. But certainly in hospitalized patients, there was some concern about cardiotoxicity, patients that had more heart rhythm problems when they took the drug. And we know that's one of the characteristic side effects. There were GI symptoms for people who took the drug, and we know that's one of the characteristic side effects. So you would think, again, in a patient that's already sick and frail within the hospital or in the ICU, invoking those side effects is not going to do any good for them, and again has the potential to do harm, which is exactly obviously what we're trying to prevent with very, very medically fragile patients.
Right. Let me read a quote to you now. This is from the Medical Officer of Health for the province of Ontario, Dr. Kieran Moore, and we'll bring this graphic up if we could, Sheldon. In an answer to a question by TVO's John Michael McGrath, the Chief Medical Officer of Health, Kieran Moore, said the province is working very diligently to have a system in place across Ontario that these therapies could be available in the treatment of unvaccinated individuals. We're talking monoclonal antibodies. Here's the quote. We're looking at expanding the ability to treat individuals who are unvaccinated with monoclonal antibodies. We're also in active conversation to review with our federal counterparts the Merck oral antiviral and the Pfizer oral antiviral. These could help further protect our health system, help reduce the impact of this virus on those who remain unvaccinated, and be important options. His words, important options. Between these antiviral pills and the monoclonal antibodies, all of which we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes, do you think we now have a sort of very certain alternative to vaccines?
So I wouldn't say these are alternatives to vaccines. And the reason being is that there are a lot of steps along the way which can go wrong. Someone can minimize their symptoms, not get tested. Someone can get tested and the turnaround is too late. Someone can get tested and not able to access these compounds. And so, there's all these steps that can go along the way. Certainly, if they get scaled up, they're going to be an alternate. They're going to be a good option for patients if they're unvaccinated. It's still not as profound as getting vaccinated in terms of reducing the risk of hospitalization. We've been a part of a provincial pilot, actually, to get monoclonals into the community. And we've had good success, especially in patients who are unvaccinated. Not that we encourage that, but again, giving those people a shot to not overwhelm our healthcare system. So, yeah, absolutely. They're going to be good as a healthcare adjunct. They're going to be good to maintain ICU capacities at low levels. They're going to be good to phase up to make sure that not only unvaccinated patients, but high-risk vaccinated patients who have breakthrough infections have access to something that keeps them away from hospital. But again, I get very uncomfortable labeling this as an alternative to vaccine because again, those steps that go wrong along the way can often lead to someone being diagnosed with COVID on their way to the ICU when we had so many chances to intervene in the process to keep them out of hospital.
Gotcha. That's Dr. Zain Chagla, infectious disease physician, St. Joseph's Healthcare, Hamilton. Always good to have you on our program, Dr. Chagla. Thanks for joining us.
No problem. All the best.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.